Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and today we're continuing one of our older Let's Talk Lore series. Previously, we started talking about the military rank and titles under the Han Dynasty and into the Three Kingdoms, and we only did one episode where we featured Tier 1 and Tier 2 ranks. Now, we're going to continue this series till its completion, with Episode 2 here, talking about the Tier 3 ranks. So just as a reminder for those of you who might not remember our previous episode, the Han court used a 6-tier system that was called 一品, 二品, 三品, 四品, 五品, 六品, with the first character meaning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the second character meaning tier. So this is the 6-tier system for generals, and in our previous episode we talked about the top 2 tiers of generals, 一品 and 二品. And within the 一品 tier, there is the Grand General, or 大将军, and there's only one of these generals, and they're basically the supreme commander of the military. They rank even above the 3 excellency positions, and that includes the Grand Commandant, because you have to consider that Grand Commandant was more of a civil servant rather than a general. He was in charge of the military, but he was more on the administrative side, whereas the Grand General is going to be your supreme commander on the battlefield. Then moving on to Tier 2, we had 3 generals called the General of the Cavalry, General of the Chariot, and General who protects. And these 3 generals are equal tier to the 3 Grand Excellency position and rank just slightly below 大将军 or the Grand General. And their rank in this order: Cavalry above Chariots, above protects. And finally, you have the 4 direction sets with 4 generals who conquer, called 四征将军. So you have the general who conquers the north, general who conquers the south, general who conquers the west, general who conquers the east. And by the same logic, you have another 4 direction set called 4 generals who defends, called 四镇将军. And in our previous episode, we talked a little bit about each, about what type of characters had these positions, and we talked about how since the government before 220 was the Han government, it was until 220 when Cao Pi abolished the Han that you had officially 3 different governments called the Three Kingdoms. Before that, Cao Cao's group had the control of the court, so only they can give out these key positions, and Liu Bei and Sun Quan had to rely on other sources to give their generals titles because they don't have access to the imperial court since they still respected the Han imperial court at the time, so they had other methods, and we're going to see those methods play out in these lower tiers that we're going to talk about in future episodes. So in today's episode, we're only going to focus on Tier 3, and there's 4 groups within Tier 3. So the first title and the highest ranking Tier 3 general is called 中领军, or General of the Center. Now, 中领军, or General of the Center, is a very key post, and we'll talk about this in more detail. But right below them, just going over this list before we jump into each one, we have another 4 direction set with the 4 generals who secures, called 四安将军. Now, these obviously are going to be ranked below the 4 direction sets that were mentioned in previous tiers, but they're going to rank higher than the 4 direction set that follows them, called the 4 generals who pacify, or 四平将军. And finally, we have what's most interesting during this time period, called the Miscellaneous Name General. Now, this is basically me giving it a translation, because there is really no direct translation. In Chinese, these are called 杂号将军. And the first character here, 杂, means miscellaneous or random or just assortment of items. And what it really means is titles that were created for specific generals at the time for certain purposes. And this was the method most of the Three Kingdoms used while the Han government was still in existence to give their generals titles. They just made up new ones. And these are clumped together and called miscellaneous name generals. And this group exists within Tier 3, Tier 4, and Tier 5, and they populated most of the generals' titles at the time. And in game, we see titles like the Flying Swallow, and that type of general title would belong in this miscellaneous name generals. Basically, these are cool titles or nicknames given to generals, and they didn't officially exist during the Han Empire's court system. Now, the Han Empire also assigned these for special occasions, and some of the more standardized ones were the General of the Cavalry, General of the Chariot, evolved from these miscellaneous name general titles that were created in the early periods of the Han Dynasty. So with this general overview, let's look at each one of these individually. So first up, we have General of the Center, or 中领军, and this post is exclusive to the Wei Kingdom, as it was created in 207 by Cao Cao, and the purpose of this position is for a general to be in command of the center army and the 5 field lieutenants, and the imperial army, which included palace guards, city guards, imperial cavalry, and etc. And many of these positions, the 5 field lieutenant, will come up in lower tiers in future episodes, so we're not going to talk too much about it. But the main duty of this assortment of positions is to ensure the safety of the capital and the palace. So this general of the center is basically in charge of capital security and basically all the battle-ready troops within the capital area. So this is a very key post. And Cao Cao created this position in 207 because I believe he was getting ready to push himself to become emperor if he had had success at Chibi. But obviously he was set back during that battle, so this plan probably got scrapped. But this generalship post stayed, and this position was continued all the way into the Jin Dynasty and eventually even to the Sui Dynasty, as Zhong Lingjun became this general that was basically put in charge of what's called Jinjun, or the Imperial Army. And the first general to ever take this position in 207 was Shi Huan. Now, Shi Huan is not featured very heavily in the game, but he was basically a lieutenant that was very loyal to Cao Cao and stayed around Cao Cao's forces from the beginning, so he was trusted with this very key position to protect the capital. Now, unfortunately for him, by the time he took the post in 207, he was already very old, and in 209 he died of sickness. And after his death, before they could find a more permanent general to take on this post, Xia Houyuan, who is basically Cao Cao's in-law, assumed the role in the interim before they found Han Hao, who, as you can see in game, is given the title Feeder of Armies because he was one of 2 generals who helped came up with the plan of Tun Tian, and he was also very trusted within Cao Cao's circle, and he was picked to take this position on, and he served in this position until the year 219 when he died. And then afterward, you hit 220, which is when the Han government got abolished and Cao Pi took over as emperor. And as you can imagine, when Cao Pi took over as emperorship, there was going to be a lot of resistance within the Han loyalist factions, so this position was only entrusted to key family members like Cao Zhen and Cao Xiu following that point. And of course, this position continued on for a long time, and we're not going to talk about the succession beyond this point. And with General of the Center wrapped up, we move on to the 4 General who secures, or Si An Jiangjun. Now, this position is relatively new in the Han court. Near the end of the Eastern Han Dynasty, this position wasn't a 4-direction position, it was only a 2-direction position. The Han government used what's called the General who secured the West in Yangding, and General who secured the East in Taoqian. Now, the reason why they only had 2 directions at this time was because the northern frontier and the southern frontier were filled with barbarians to the south and nomads to the north, and they already had lower tier generals called lieutenants that took care of certain tribes. So you have a lieutenant to the Qiang, you have a lieutenant to the Xiongnu, you have a lieutenant to the Xianbei. So they didn't need a grand general who took care of the northern and southern front. So that's why in the later stages of the Han government, you only had the west and the east with generals who secure. Now, during the Wei Kingdom, much later on, they installed general who secures the north and general who secures the south, just to make it another 4-directional set. Now, those generals are much lesser known, so we're not going to talk too much about it. But this also gives you a view on how Tao Qian really shouldn't be a strategist. He's not really the nice old guy you know him to be in the Three Kingdoms game or even in lore. They only made him a nice and caring character to kind of paint Cao Cao slightly worse and Liu Bei slightly better. In reality, he was a pretty aggressive general with a short temper in his youth. Now, of course, he might have toned it down a little when he is much older, but he was definitely complicit in killing Cao Cao's father as Cao Cao was encroaching on his land during the start of the Three Kingdom period. Now, moving on beyond the 4 general who secures, you have a lower tier called 4 general who pacifies, or Si Ping Jiangjun. And in this post, like many of the posts that were listed before, you don't always have a general who exists for this position. The reason being, if you already had a general who secures the west and secures the east, you don't need to give another general of lower tier and put them there as a general who pacifies the West and pacifies the East. Like, that general would be there and have nothing to do because his boss will be one tier above him and taking command of his every move. So that's kind of a waste of resources. The only characters who took on this post during the Three Kingdoms period are two generals who are generals who pacifies the North, and they occurred for different kingdoms. So Zhang Yan here eventually surrendered his Black Mountain bandits over to Cao Cao, and he took on the position of general who pacifies the North, and this was passed on to his son after his death, and he had a very nice life as the general who pacified the North for Cao Cao, as you basically use the bandit to take control of a bandit territory, so he had a very easy time pacifying the North. On the other hand, you had Ma Dai, who is Ma Chao's cousin, and he was the general who pacifies the North for the Shu Han kingdom. And for Shu's side, his position is very different because the North is the Hanzhong region, and this was the region where Ma Chao last garrisoned in. So following Ma Chao's death, Ma Dai kind of took over in this role and got the position of the general who pacified the North for the Shu Han kingdom. Okay, so this is all the key set positions that were created during the Han court. Now we move on to the much juicier stuff, or the miscellaneous name generals, or 杂号将军. And these generals, like we mentioned before, are basically generals with titles that were created specifically for them. And a lot of these titles were created during this time period by all three kingdoms to kind of bypass the fact that only Cao Cao had access to the imperial court. And these titles can be tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, depending on what they're set to when they were created. Now for this episode, since we're talking about tier 3, we're only going to list out the ones that are classified as tier 3, and they are 征楚将军, or the general who attacks Shu, 征虏将军, or the general who attacks nomads, 镇军将军, or the general who safeguards the army, 镇护将军, general who safeguards, 安众将军, general who secures the people, 安宜将军, the general who secures the eastern nomads, 安远将军, or the general who secures faraway lands, and you have 平寇将军, 平鲁将军, 平敌将军, and these are basically general who pacifies the bandit, pacifies the nomads, and pacifies the western nomads. And then you have 平难将军, which is general who pacifies the crisis, 辅国将军, general who assists the country, 虎牙将军, the general of the tiger's teeth. Now, the tiger's teeth, or huya, in this situation refers to a very elite group of troops that's designed to guard the emperor. So it's kind of like the emperor's bodyguards general. And then you had 轻车将军, or the general of the light cavalry, 冠军将军, or the general of the champion. And then you have 度辽将军, or the general who crosses the Lao. And Lao is the northwest land that was in the territory close to Korea. And then you have 横海将军, or the general who crosses the sea. Now, there's lots of these titles. They occur throughout the later Han periods and into the Third Kingdom. We're not going to talk about every single one of these just because they're kind of randomly created in most instances. We're only going to talk about the more famous ones that were assigned to characters, just so you get a little bit of reference to who had these posts. So first off, 征虏将军, or the general who attacked the nomad, was given to Zhang Fei by Liu Bei. Now, you're going to see a lot of Shu and Wu characters in this list just because they utilize this miscellaneous name general trick to kind of circumvent the court. So next up is 镇军将军, or the general who safeguards the army, and that was Zhao Yun. And then you have general who pacifies the nomads, or 平鲁将军, in Zhou Tai. And then general who pacifies the western nomads in Zhang He. Now, this general is a Wei general, so they did also use these miscellaneous name general, and I think it's pretty cool. You know, you go out on campaign and you get a very special, unique title that's only given to you. And then finally, you have 辅国将军, or the general who assists the country, and that was Lu Xun in the kingdom of Wu. So this kind of wrap up the general idea of tier 3 generals for our episode. And we're going to come back and talk about tier 4 generals, where we're going to get another huge list of these miscellaneous name generals, as well as some other more standardized titles going forward. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye!